Hello everybody and welcome back to the series. In this video we're going to finally get around to installing an upgraded fuel pump on my 370Z as part of my pre-work to get it ready for forced induction, as I'm going to be installing a supercharger here in a couple. We just had a power outage. And we're back online. I apologize for that delay, guys. We just got over a power outage here. But yeah, so in this video I'm going to be covering how to upgrade your fuel pump. This is a necessary upgrade to make if you are installing a supercharger or turbocharger on your vehicle to be able to make the increased fuel demands that the supercharger is going to require to make all that power. We're not going to be covering a return style fuel system. That's going to be in the next video. A return style fuel system is also an important upgrade to make, especially if you're going to be running higher boost pressure. It's going to make the car run a lot better, but I'll talk a little bit more on why you might consider installing one in that next video. Today we're just going to be covering how to upgrade the fuel pump. One quick disclaimer, guys, we are going to be working with an open fuel system today, and that can be dangerous if you're not taking the right precautions. You don't want to have any sources of flame anywhere near you. When we're working with the electrical system, we're going to make sure that the battery is unplugged. You just want to make sure that you don't end up having any sources of spark or flame anywhere near you that could potentially catch your gasoline on fire. Fire is bad, guys. We want to try to avoid that. The other thing is make sure you work in a well-ventilated area, maybe open up a window or two. Just make sure you get some good airflow. As the gas fumes begin to evaporate, as you get gas in the air, it can be bad for you if you inhale it. You can start getting lightheaded and a bunch of other nasty things. So just make sure you're working in a well-ventilated area. That way you're not just constantly inhaling fumes. By the way, guys, one thing I might recommend you get, but it's not necessary, is to get a fuel access port and then a fuel pressure gauge to put on there. Although it's not necessary, it's really helpful in verifying that your new fuel pump works. This fuel access port that I have is from Z1 Motorsports. It comes with 2 access ports so you can install a fuel gauge, as well as potentially a line for nitrous if you decide to run NO2. It's fairly straightforward to install this. You're basically going to take out one of the plugs and install your fuel gauge. You'll then undo the 2 bolts for the fuel damper here, and then it just installs right in between the fuel damper and the fuel line leading over to the fuel rails. By the way, guys, one helpful tip for this: when you are installing an access port, make sure you depressurize your fuel line, otherwise you could get fuel just going everywhere. This can happen naturally if you just leave the car sitting in the garage for a few days. You should slowly lose pressure in the line by itself. But if you just turn the car off and you want to depressurize your line, what you can do is you can actually unplug the fuse for the fuel pump. You can then attempt to start the car, and it'll begin to idle for maybe a few seconds before it ends up sputtering and then the engine dies. That ensures that you have almost no fuel pressure here, and that it should keep things nice and clean when you install this. Again, the fuel access port is completely optional. It's just a nice tool to have to verify your fuel pump's working. It actually saved me when I made my first attempt at installing the fuel pump, because I'd actually messed up the first time, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. But yeah, let's get to getting the fuel pump out of the car so we can modify the housing and install our brand new Aeromotive 340 liter per hour fuel pump. So with the battery unplugged one last time, we are going to now locate our fuel pump. So the fuel pump actually sits behind the passenger seat, underneath this little shelf here next to the cubby. To get better access to it, you can just push your seat all the way forward. I'm actually going to take mine out because we are going to be running a couple of wires here on the inside to get to the battery. So to make access easier and to be able to have more room for filming, I'm going to take my seat out. There's 2 bolts in the back, which might be difficult to see here, but there's 2 connecting the back corners. There's also going to be 2 on the front, and there's going to be a plug or 2 on the bottom that we have to undo, and then I can just pull the entire chair out, and it's going to give me a lot more room to work in here. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and try and get access to the fuel pump now, which sits underneath this matting here. To make this easier, you can actually pull this cubby all the way forward, pull it out, and then just kind of set that aside. And with the cubby removed, it's pretty easy to just kind of get your fingers under here, pull up, and remove the mat. And with that foam piece out of the way, we've got much better access to the fuel pump cover here. These are the 4 bolts that we're going to need to remove, all of which are 10 millimeters. This piece of plastic does get in the way a little bit, so I'm going to see if I can kind of finagle with a couple of the panels here to give me just a little bit better access so it's easier to pull this out. I did end up removing the side panel here just to make running wires a little bit easier. I do actually have a tutorial video that shows how to take out all the interior panels on the Z. See the link in the top right corner. This bottom panel you don't actually have to remove. You can pretty much work around it when trying to gain access to the pump. And on second thought, I'm not even going to bother with trying to remove the trim panel. We should be able to just work with what we have. So we've got 4 10mm nuts, 2 here, and 2 right here. So we're going to go ahead and undo all of those. So with those 4 bolts removed, we're going to lift this plate up now. And it looks like there may be a wiring harness that we're going to have to undo to be able to free it. If we can't get that wiring harness out, then we'll probably just try and slide the plate down a little bit here. So I've got that plate shifted off to the side now. There is the plug in question. It looks like there's a little release tab here that we can maybe press on to try and pull it off. I'm gonna have to finagle with this for just a little bit to see if I can get this plug released. Alright, so we've got this plug removed now. Pressing on this tab releases the entire plug, not just the little hat here that looks to flip up. I was confused there. I kept pulling on the top of this, but the entire plug just comes out. And you can see there where the socket is. So I went ahead and also pulled this through the cover plate, as you guys saw. So this grommet's just kind of sitting in there. So I'm just kind of setting that off to the side now. And the next thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to undo this fuel line. Now, you want to make sure that your fuel pressure is down to about 0 again. I actually managed to go and attempt to start the car. And after it died down over a few seconds, the fuel pressure dropped to only a few PSI. So now we're going to go ahead and try and undo the fuel line here. There may still be, as I said, a bit of pressure because it's at 4 PSI, so I'm kind of surrounding this area with towels. I also might recommend wearing some glasses or goggles and maybe a mask or something just to kind of keep the gas from getting over you. And then I'm going to try and take this off with a towel and just try and limit the amount of gas that gets everywhere. So if you guys didn't catch that, all you have to do is pinch on this retainer ring, and then this connection pulls away. And I did spill a little bit of gas, but I've got pretty much all of it cleaned up here. Again, keep the car pretty well ventilated, maybe pop the trunk, keep the door open. That'll just make sure that you've got plenty of air and that you won't be breathing in a ton of gasoline. So I've got most of that cleaned up now. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we need to remove, I believe there's 6 of these little 8mm bolts. These are pretty special. They're a very specific length. So try not to lose them. The bits of cloth that I have kind of surrounding the fuel pump here kind of will prevent me from losing any of the screws down underneath the frame. But just be really careful when you're pulling these out, just to make sure you don't lose them. Also at this point, it'd be a really good idea to go ahead and open up your gas filler cap just to make sure that the gas tank is depressurized. Shouldn't be much of an issue, but just an extra precautionary step that you want to take. Plus it'll help divert some of the gas fumes away from you as you're beginning to take the fuel pump out. Alright, so I've gotten all but one of the screws out now. I just want to tell you, these bolts are ridiculous. They're really difficult to get out. They're like not even an 8 or 9mm. It's just really bizarre. So what I've been doing is using like a set of vice grips to clamp onto it initially to break it loose, and then using a Phillips screwdriver to take it out the rest of the way. But I'm going to get this last bolt out here so that way we can remove this retaining ring. So one thing, guys, on these plates, you want to make sure that when you reinstall them later, they're in the correct orientation. For that cover plate that we took off, this side that pushes out is going to be on top, and then there's an arrow here that actually marks what direction it's supposed to face on the car. So you don't really need to actually mark this with anything like most of the instructions I've seen will have you do. This foam thing should be on the bottom, obviously. Now for this retaining ring, there's a flat on the back here, and that flat actually faces towards the back of the car, so that's how I'm going to remember which way to install it. You can mark these with a Sharpie or whatever you happen to have to make it a bit easier, but I'm not going to bother doing that. So just to keep that in mind, you want to make sure you install these in the same position. For the fuel pump housing itself, the orientation is also pretty clear. This little socket should be towards the front of the car, with the piping here for the gasoline towards the back. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to try and pull this whole fuel pump assembly up a couple of inches, and there's going to be an O-ring that we're going to try and remove. We want to make sure that it doesn't touch any gas, otherwise it could ruin the seal. So I'm going to see if I can raise this up. Now you want to be really careful because there's a lot of fragile parts on this fuel pump, so try not to use a ton of force when you're pulling this up. This blue here is the O-ring that we're talking about, so we're going to see if we can get this out. So this blue O-ring here is what we were after. It sits right on the top of the tank. You kind of just peel it away from the tank surface. So we're going to go and wash this off just to make sure there's no gas on it that could potentially ruin the rubber. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and try and pull this assembly up. It is very important to be careful as you're doing so. It's an extremely tight fit. Stuff's going to be snagging and you don't want to damage anything, so try not to use a whole lot of force here. There is also a hose that we have to disconnect. Once I find it, I'll try and show you guys. Alright, so this is the hose that I'm talking about. It looks like it's similar to the one we already disconnected. We're just going to press in 2 tabs to pull the hose loose. Then I'm going to get a bucket real quick to hold this fuel pump housing, because it's going to have a fair amount of gas. Even with the fuel level as low as it is, it's still going to have some gas sitting within the housing. So I just want something to catch all that so it's not spilling all over the garage and on the car. Maneuvering the housing out of the tank can be a little bit tricky because the bobber for the fuel level sensor can sometimes catch on the lip of the tank, but if you rotate the whole housing assembly sideways, it makes it easier to pull out. Make sure to not use a whole lot of force here, because if you do snag this bobber, you don't want to bend the rod. Alright guys, it's time to get to the fun part, actually modifying our fuel pump housing. Now first things first, you're going to need an upgraded fuel pump. I have an Aeromotive 340 liter power fuel pump. This is going to be sufficient for the amount of fuel that I need. If you're staying between 500 or 600 horsepower, this should be enough for you. If you're going to run E85, however, or if you're looking for greater horsepower figures, you're probably going to need a larger fuel pump. For that, you might consider something like a Walbro 450. The problem with the Walbro 450s, however, is that it does use a larger bottom diameter, which makes modifying the fuel pump housing a little bit more intensive, because you're going to need to do a little more extensive modification than you would with this 340. I'm going to show you guys what you need to do to be able to make both of them work within this fuel pump housing. With this fuel pump, I did also get an installation kit, so it includes a little sleeve here. This is to help hold it within the housing. I also have a small length of fuel line here, but I think I'm going to upgrade this and get a slightly longer piece for the fuel pump housing. And you're probably going to get some of these little hose clamps as well. I am also, as an optional extra, going to be installing CJM's aluminum top hat. This is just a really nice, durable piece of equipment that makes fuel return systems really easy, because it has a couple of access ports here to be able to run additional fuel lines. It's more durable than the top plastic on these. Sometimes these fuel pump housings are known to crumble, especially if you're trying to drill a hole in it to do a fuel return system. Having something like this just makes it a whole lot nicer, and it does also come with some of these additional plugs, which makes wiring it a little bit easier as well. We are going to be upgrading our gauge on our wires. We're going to be going for a larger diameter wire to be able to run more current, so it's nice to be able to have these plugs. It's just going to make installing it easier, and it also comes with this nice flexible piece of fuel line, as well as some of the other pieces of equipment to be able to make it happen. So I'm going to show you guys how to install this today, as well as if you just plan to keep your plastic top hat, I'll show you what you need to do with that as well. One thing, if you want to avoid making the mistakes that I have, which I'll be explaining here in a second, make sure you go through and read this really helpful manual from CJM. You can get their PDF online. I'll leave a link in the description below, but it's very handy in explaining how to disassemble this housing and modify it to be able to fit any sort of fuel pump that you're going to be putting in here. It also explains how the whole fuel pump system works, so you don't make the same mistakes that I did. But anyways, let's go ahead and get to modifying the housing. Alright, so first things first, we're going to go ahead and unplug all of the electrical wires that are leading up to the bottom of this top hat here. Before you do that, you want to make sure you take note of what each of those wires are. The reason for this is that we are going to be modifying the plug that plugs into the top of this hat. So we need to know which wires are sitting in which positions. Now I'm going to go ahead and show on the screen now what those wiring positions look like for the 2009 to 2015 harness. Here's the bottom of the top hat showing where each of those connections are. Here's what it looks like on the top of the hat and the socket side. And then for the 2016 models, it looks slightly different. This is kind of how everything's going to be plugged in. And then it looks something like this on the top as well. It's just important to know where everything plugs in, because when we go to put these wires back in place, we want to make sure we put them back in the correct locations. So just take note of that. So we're going to go ahead and unplug each of those connections now. We're just going to pull on them pretty firmly to release each of those from the top hat. Alright, and that's the last one unplugged. For these clips, by the way, there's a little tab that sits on them. If you press down on that tab, it's a little bit easier to remove them from the socket here, so keep that in mind. Alright, so with that removed, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the level sensor here. There's a little tab that sits here, right over there. All you got to do is press that tab in, and then pull up pretty firmly on that sensor, and they should be able to move it up and out of the way. Try and pull the wires out. There's a little wire retainer that sits on the side over here. Pull the wires out, and then we can take that fuel level sensor out. We'll set that aside. We're also going to remove this fuel temperature sensor. There's two little tabs on either side. Just kind of separate them and lift the sensor up to get it out of the way there. We'll pull the wires out of this little tab that's holding it on the side. All right, and then we have the fuel level sensor as well as that fuel temperature sensor removed. We're going to set these aside. We're going to put them on later. All right, so the next part can be a bit tricky. We got to try and remove this little white tab that holds the top hat onto the bottom here and doesn't let it slip out. There's only one of those tabs. We can see here on the other side that there is none on the rod, but we need to go ahead and try and take this off. So with that white tab removed, and be careful not to lose this because we're going to reuse it later, but with that removed, we're going to go ahead and separate the top hat now from those rods and take any springs that you have and any spacers, set those aside. We'll reuse those again later as well. Now the next step is important, guys. It kind of depends on what you're planning on doing with the fuel pump housing. If you are using the CJM aluminum top hat like I'm going to be installing, we need to cut this little fuel hose right here so we can install our new top hat. If you are installing a Walbro 450, anything with that larger bottom diameter, you're going to need to cut this as well most likely, and I'll show you why here in a second. But if you are planning on installing a 340 liter per hour fuel pump and you're going to be using the stock hat, leave that fuel hose in place because it's going to be reused later and you don't want to cut it because you can't reinstall it. So because I'm installing the top hat here, that fuel hose is not going to be needed anymore. So we're going to go ahead, cut that in half. I'm going to pull this away. Now if you're going to be installing a Walbro 450 pump and you're going to be reusing your plastic top hat, you'll need to use an X-Acto knife here on the edge to be able to cut away the section of hose that's attached. You just need to make a small incision to be able to separate it from the top hat, and then you can pull that bottom hose off. Same thing goes from the bottom here. If you have cut this hose in half, we're going to need to make a small incision with an X-Acto knife right here, and then we're just going to pull that hose right off of the fuel pump housing. Alright, now for the next step, we're going to remove this bucket from the actual fuel pump housing itself. This is pretty straightforward. On either side, if you can see there are a couple of tabs. If you pull the fuel bucket kind of outward and away, you should be able to lift the housing out from the bucket. This might take a little bit of force because there's a bit of friction sitting in between the fuel pump regulator and this little swirl jet on the bottom. But with those tabs out, if you just give it a good firm pull, you should be able to separate the two of these apart. Alright guys, now with everything separated out, I want to talk to you about how this fuel pump housing system works. It's sort of important to understand everything before we begin further modifying the housing. To start with, this little bucket here that sits on the bottom has a one-way valve in it. As the fuel pump begins to draw fuel out of here, fuel is permitted to flow into this bucket where it then sits and is sucked up through the fuel pump using the sock filter, which allows you to get out most of the large bits of dirt and things. The fuel pump actually sits inside this housing here. That fuel ends up getting pumped through this hose. That hose goes to an internal filter that sits within the housing itself. This lets you get out the finer stuff that's in there and helps you prevent the fuel injectors from getting clogged. Once that fuel reaches the other side of the filter over here, it's allowed to permit through two different directions. First off, you have a fuel pressure regulator that sits over on this side. This fuel pressure regulator is what actually governs the fuel pressure, and it's connected directly to the fuel filter. And it's what caused me to mess up the first time I was trying to install this. I'll explain in a second. But that fuel then gets pumped up through the little hose here that we just removed, and that goes through to the top of the housing and then goes off to the engine. Now in addition, if y'all recall that fuel hose that we removed earlier, I believe that fuel line is actually coming from the sending unit, which sits behind the driver's side. You see the gas tank is actually shaped like a saddle, so some of the fuel ends up collecting in that side as well at a low point. So another fuel pump actually sends fuel up through here and then passes through this additional hose and then is allowed to go through a little swirl jet that sits here in the bottom of the bucket. CJM Motorsports actually has a really nice diagram explaining how all the fuel flows through this system. I highly recommend you take a look at it because it'll show you how exactly the fuel is routed through here. The mistake that I had made in trying to modify the housing the first time around was I was actually installing a Walbro 450 pump. Now the thing with the Walbro 450s, is they have this larger diameter here on the bottom, and it means it can't actually sit inside the housing very well, so you have to modify it extensively by cutting away half of this internal fuel filter. Now, by cutting away the fuel filter, we're technically bypassing this fuel pressure regulator. The inlet to this fuel pressure regulator fits inside the housing. I didn't understand this the first time. I actually thought that the fuel pressure was regulated externally, maybe through this hose, and I didn't understand how the flow worked very well. And by bypassing that regulator and running my hose directly from the fuel pump up to the housing, when I turned the fuel pump on for the first time, it overpressurized my fuel line. I peaked at about 100 PSI before the hose that I installed on this top hat ended up coming loose. This is a completely honest mistake that I made because this is the first time I've ever had to mess with a fuel system. Fortunately, I had the fuel pressure gauge on the car and I was able to identify what exactly was wrong. So this time around, I'm actually installing a 340 liter per hour fuel pump because it means I can maintain my internal fuel filter, and I'll talk about this here in a second. But just make sure you guys understand how all the components in this work before we begin modifying it. While we're on the subject of mistakes, the second big one that I made, if you can kind of see here on the outside of this fuel pump that I was originally trying to install, this 450, as well as on the inside of this fuel pump housing, you can see the cutaway, by the way, there that I had to make to get it to fit. This is the result of me using electrical tape on the outside of the fuel pump to try and act as a friction stop so it would hold inside the housing pretty well. Now, before you guys get on my case about using electrical tape in a gasoline environment, I already knew that gasoline breaks down most adhesives. I actually went online and tried to research to see if there was a type of tape that was resistant to gasoline, and 3M claimed that this electrical tape would work well and wouldn't break down. That clearly isn't the case. So my big recommendation to you guys, do not use any sort of tape or adhesive within the housing. The gasoline is going to break it down regardless if the company claims that it's gasoline resistant or not. So just keep that in mind. Alright, so regardless of the type of fuel pump that you're going to be installing, we're going to need to take the old fuel pump out, which means we're going to need to detach the hose here that connects over to the fuel filter. Once again, we're just going to use a razor blade of some sort, and we're just going to make a shallow incision to be able to pull off the fuel pump hose, like that. And now in order to extract this fuel pump, if you look there inside on the little ring that connects to the fuel pump housing, there's a couple of little tabs that you're going to need to separate, and then you should be able to twist the fuel pump out, and then it should be able to fall through the bottom. Alright, it's time to get to the part that worries a lot of people, which is modifying the Venturi system here on the fuel bucket. See, the way that it works, as I said previously, is you got a fuel pressure regulator here, and that fuel pressure regulator bleeds off excess fuel to moderate the pressure. And that fuel goes into that little Venturi system there, it connects up there. And then there's just a little nozzle on the end of this that ends up pouring that fuel out. Now with the larger fuel pump that we're going to be using, that fuel pump is going to want to flow more fuel up through the housing. So that fuel pressure regulator is going to need to be able to release a lot more of that fuel to be able to regulate the pressure properly. The little nozzle that sits on the end of this acts as a restrictor for that relief system, so we need to modify it by increasing the diameter so that way it can flow more fuel through it. Now I've already done this on the old fuel bucket that I have, and I can still reuse this component. It's just in a lot better condition. I don't want to try drilling this again, so let me show you the original footage that I took on how to modify it. In order to pop it out so that we can get better access to it, we need to push on that little black piece in there to be able to force it a little bit further out so that we can have access to it when we're working on it. Alright, so we've got this little orifice pulled up here, if you can kind of see right there. Now the amount that you're going to have to drill out this orifice is going to depend on the size of your fuel pump. CJM Motorsports does give a couple of recommendations on how much you need to drill out in their PDF. You should see that on screen now. I'm going to be going for the 450 liter per hour orifice size, so that means that I'm going to be drilling out pretty much most of the face of that Venturi tube. I'm going to start with the smallest possible drill bit. And a quick warning for you guys, you do not want to drill all the way through this Venturi tube, otherwise you're going to mess up the flow mechanics of this system. So I've actually gone and marked the end of my drill bit with where the stop is so that the end of the drill bit is in the middle of this little Venturi piece here. So just make sure you don't drill all the way, otherwise you could mess this up. So we're going to start off with a smaller drill bit and work our way up. Alright, the first bit was a success, let's step it up. Alright, so the 7/64 seems to be exactly what I want. The orifice now looks pretty close to what they have in that picture, and I don't dare go any further. So we're pretty much done modifying this piece. we should be able to push that back into place like such. We're going to set this aside, and now we're going to begin work on modifying the main fuel pump housing to be able to fit the new fuel pump. So the fuel bucket nozzle there modified, we can set that aside. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to modify the housing itself. Now if you see that little retaining ring in there, that's pretty specific to the factory fuel pump. And it's not going to work with the new fuel pump that we're going to be installing, or indeed most other fuel pumps that you'll put in your car. So that retaining ring actually restricts us from being able to slide this fuel pump all the way up through the housing. It actually gets in the way. So we need to cut that retaining ring out. Now if you look inside there, you can see that there are like 3 little tabs. We're going to try and cut those away using like some scissors or a knife or something, just to kind of separate that retaining ring. So you can see there that I've gone and removed that retaining ring, and we just have those 3 tabs left in there, which we're going to need to sand out and bore it smooth. For that, I'm just going to use a sanding bit on a Dremel tool. Now you want to be careful if you're going to sand this. Don't over sand it and end up sanding all the way through to the inside of the filter. That system is still going to be pressurized, so we want to make sure that it's sealed. So just be careful that you don't over sand.
1, 2, 3.
Alright, now you can see that I have managed to clear those tabs out from the inside. It's pretty much bored smooth. If you're using a 340 like what I'm about to install, which is the Aeromotive here, that's all the modification that you should need to do the housing. However, if you're installing a 450 like this, there's usually a larger diameter that sits on the bottom of these pumps, and it prevents you from being able to slide it all the way into this housing. So in order to fit it, you're going to need to modify the housing by actually cutting a portion of the filter here away. Now I'm not going to do this to this housing because I have decided to switch back to a 340, but let me roll the old footage that I took, which shows you how to modify this correctly. Alright, so we're going to try and pull off this Venturi fuel pump assembly, which includes this piece as well as the T-fitting down here attached by this hose. If you can kind of see right here, there's a little clip, and we need to separate the 2 tabs on either side to be able to pull up this portion, and then we should be able to wiggle on the T-joint down here back and forth to be able to eventually pull it out and separate it. So there you go, you should have removed all of this now. Again, that T-joint on the bottom, just lightly twist it back and forth, and you should be able to pull that out. Alright guys, to show you how to mark the spot that you're going to want to cut, you want to line up the bucket and the fuel pump housing next to each other. Make sure that this tab lines up with the hole in the bucket, because this is going to represent how far in the fuel pump housing is going to sit within the bucket here. And then you want to go ahead and install the filter on your pump. So for this sock filter that's provided with the kit that I got, you literally just push it on and then it holds it on by friction, so it's not coming off. And then what you want to do is you're going to want to line this up such that the bottom of the fuel filter lines up with a little bit above the bottom of the bucket, so maybe a millimeter or so. And then you see there how the mark lines up with the increased diameter of the pump. That's why I marked it there. So that way when we put this fuel pump in, the bottom of, or rather the top of this little flange should line up with this, and the sock should be sitting correctly in the bucket. So that's how I made the mark here, and we're going to go ahead and work on cutting this now. Oh, and before I forget, we will be cutting out the main body of this, but don't cut this portion that connects to that T-joint. So I'm actually going to start cutting from the back, and I'm going to stop right before we get to that point. I may end up using a Dremel to get a little more precise, but just be careful because you don't want to ruin this fitting. Alright, so the next step is we're going to prep our fuel pump to get it installed in our housing. The first thing you're going to want to do is install your fuel filter. Now they provide one for you here from the Aeromotive kit, but this fuel filter is really difficult to get to fit in the housing. So I'm using this sock filter that originally came with my 450. It's going to fit that bucket a little bit nicer. So I've gone ahead and already installed that. On those fuel pumps, if you can see there, there's a little retaining ring that holds the center of the pump on, and then there's the actual inlet for the fuel filter. And this one's nice and flexible, so it fits in the housing very well, whereas this one has a really hard plastic and it really doesn't bend that well. And so it's difficult to get it to actually sit inside this bucket, so I'm not using this one. The other thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to install this friction sleeve here. This is what's actually going to allow it to sit inside the housing pretty well. So we're going to slip this over our fuel pump. By the way, this sleeve is rated to be exposed to gasoline. It's just a little sleeve that CJM provides. It's very important to not use something like electrical tape like I originally did, so just be careful in the material that you're using here. Just see if you can find one of these sleeves. But now we're going to go ahead and install it into our fuel pump housing. And that little sleeve is going to give it some resistance because it's supposed to help hold it in place. So once we kind of got it snug in there, I'm going to try and push it up into the housing, and that sleeve might try and fight you there, so this is going to be a bit tricky. Give me a moment to play with this to see if I can get this to fit snugly. So we've got that fuel pump now sitting inside of the housing. We're going to need to fine tune the height of that in just a second, but before we do that, we're going to go ahead and connect the outlet of our fuel pump over to that inlet for the fuel filter. Because we're installing a 340 and we didn't need to modify the housing, we're going to be keeping the internal fuel filter for this. Now if you have a 450 fuel pump and you cut this away, you're not going to be reusing that filter. You're going to need to use an external filtration system. Using an external filtration system isn't necessarily required for a 450, but I would highly recommend it. These sock filters that they put on the bottom is just for straining out really coarse particles. The filter that's inside of this internally is for getting the fine stuff, and it really helps prevent your injectors from getting clogged. So if you want to check out CJM's PDF, they do have a good write-up on installing the 450s. It also tells you how to modify your regulator. That gives you instructions on how to cut this out so you can use it with a 450 fuel pump. This is where I'm going to stop talking about the 450, so if you guys do want to install a 450 yourself, go ahead and take a look at that PDF. It's really informative. All the instructions moving forward are going to be on installing the 340. So we're going to go ahead and connect that hose there. Now, you don't want to use just any fuel pump hose. If you use like your traditional rubber stuff, it's possible that it could kink. Fortunately, in the kit that CJM provided, they actually give us some of this baffled, like corrugated plastic tubing here. This stuff is resistant to kinking, so I'm actually going to use this to connect the fuel pump over to the fuel filter. Alright guys, so slight change of plan. This plastic hosing here was a bit difficult to get on, especially onto the fuel filter side where all that barbing is. I ended up actually using a heat gun to try and get this to fit on there properly, and it was actually working really well, but I overheated the plastic just a bit too much, and I actually put a small hole in it there where it melted, so I can't use that hose anymore. So I'm just using some regular fuel line here. Now the problem was, as I told you guys, you want to be careful not to get it kinked. It's not actually kinking too bad here on the end. There's just a slight bit of kinking, but it shouldn't be too bad of an issue for my setup because I'm actually going to be using this pump as a lift pump, and it's going to go over to a surge tank, which in itself actually pulls fuel from the gas tank. And skipping ahead a little bit here, guys, I've actually gone back and replaced that single piece of hose. Even though the kinking shouldn't have been an issue with the setup that I'm having, since it's only going to be a lift pump, I just wanted to make sure and show you guys what you can do to avoid kinking if you can't use that piece of plastic hosing. So these are just a couple of 90-degree joints which are connected in here in the center, and then I've got some 5/16 inch barbing that's attached on the bottom as well. I basically just attached all these pieces together using some Permatex thread locker, which is fuel resistant, to kind of get everything sealed up really nicely, and then gone ahead and used the hose clamps in there as well. Make sure that if you do this, these hoses are fairly short, that way this piece isn't butting up against the top hat when we reinstall it. But this should have no issues with kinking because it is all just metal parts here. The brass, although is not the best choice because it can sometimes be prone to corrosion, I'm not terribly worried about this right now, and when I revisit this later in the future to do an upgrade potentially for E85, I can take a look at this again and decide if I want to replace this or not. Alright guys, so now we want to set the level of our fuel filter so we can reinstall it in the bucket. Now if you see this little tab here, if you line up the bucket hole right there where it's going to sit, you want your fuel filter sock to sit at the same level as the bottom of the bucket. That way you know you're able to siphon gas off the bottom of it. So we're going to go ahead and install this now. You just make sure you set that fuel filter sock by pushing your fuel pump up so that it gets to the right height. We're going to reinstall this back in the bucket. Try and get it to line up with the tabs. You might need to use just a tad bit of force because that pipe that runs to that little Venturi bit down there uses friction to seat. So you just need to kind of give it a little bit of a push, and then it should sit in the bucket quite nicely. Alright, so now we're going to go ahead and reinstall our fuel level sensor as well as the fuel temperature sensor. Now at this point, if you were reusing your old top hat here, you would go and take your X-Acto knife and remove this piece of hosing. Then you'd go ahead and reconnect everything back into the socket locations. It's why it's important to note which socket pin goes for which of the wires. The only difference is because you upgraded to a larger fuel pump, you'll want to make sure that you use the fuel pump connector here that it came with, because it uses a larger gauge wire to be able to carry all of that additional power. However, because I am going to be installing the CJM Top Hat here, we need to make some slight modifications. So we're going to start following CJM's manual here to see if we can get the new Top Hat installed on our fuel pump. So first things first, we're going to need to reuse these metal rods for the new billet hat. So we need to get them removed here from the stock housing, and they're in there pretty tight. So in order to get them out, it's best to use a heat gun to try and heat up the plastic and get them to loosen up a little bit so we can actually remove it from the housing. There's one of them. And we've got rod number 2. Alright, so the next part is going to heavily depend on how you want to configure your top hat, if you're going to be setting it up for a fuel return system, or if you want to set it up in the factory configuration. For the radium unit, which I'm going to install to help with my one-to-one pressure regulation with forced induction, I'm actually not going to be installing a true fuel return system. Instead, I'm going to be installing a radium system which basically uses the pressure from the manifold as a reference to be able to regulate the pressure and increase it with boost. But if you want to run a fuel return system, like a true one that CJM sells, they actually have the configuration charts on there for how you should use like these plugs and things to set it up. Because I'm going to set it up as the factory pump today, I'm going to be installing 2 of these little plugs here off to either side, and then the actual fuel outlet port is going to install right in here. So I'm going to go ahead and get these installed. There's a couple of crush washers that you might be able to see in there. Those need to be on either side of this top hat to give it a good seal, that way it seals in gas. Alright guys, now this next step is extremely important to get right. We need to be very careful here. So we're going to be building these sockets to plug into the CJM Top Hat. Now you want to make sure that you wire it correctly so that the wires here correspond to the correct wires on the other side of the top hat from the factory harness. So we have 6 wires here. We're going to have the power wires from the fuel pump, which by the way we've upgraded to 12 gauge wire. You don't want to use the factory wiring for an upgraded fuel pump because it's going to require more current. We've got the 2 wires coming from our fuel level sensor and 2 wires coming from the fuel temperature sensor. So those 6 are going to plug in to these locations here on the back of our harness. Now, recall from earlier that I numbered the wires for the wiring harness, for the stock harness. Let me show you guys the numbers again for the 2016 model. Those numbers are going to correspond to these positions in the socket. So I'm showing you now a picture of the top socket and where those pins or those wires are going to be plugged into in the socket. So that's how I'm going to wire them on the top. 1 through 3 for the top row, 4 through 6 for the bottom row. Now, notice that the position of these like 2 little finger things on top kind of shows you the orientation of that socket. So now we're going to go to the bottom, and we're going to look at how those pin positions correspond to the bottom of the socket. Notice again those 2 fingers are sticking up. But you'll see that the numbers have been flipped. So instead of going 1 through 3 on the top row, it's doing 3, 2, 1 on the top row. And then for the bottom row, it's 6, 5, 4. That's because the wiring inside the socket flipped when going from the top of the hat to the bottom of it. So you got to be careful when you're putting your wires back in. I know this sounds kind of complicated. It's just the whole idea is you got to make sure that your wires are going to match up to the correct locations on the other side of this top hat. This is probably the most complicated part of this entire build, but as long as you take your measurements and you note the original wire positions and how the wiring is done here in these sockets, you should be okay. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and start building out this new socket. Alright guys, and it is the next morning now, and I spent some time thinking overnight and decided to go ahead and replace this hose here, which was a little bit kinked, but I wasn't too worried about last night. But overnight I was just kind of thinking about it and decided to replace it with that brass fitting, which I already showed you guys earlier. But that's all in place now, and I've gone ahead and plugged in the socket as well. As we can see there, it's really important to double check the wires for that to make sure that everything is plugged in correctly. The last thing we need to do is connect our hose up here to the top hat and then bring it down to the output side of the filter. Again, this is only for the 340 liter per hour fuel pump because we are reusing our filter. For the 450, you'll need to do a separate setup, and for that I'd recommend you guys check out the CJM PDF file to figure out how to implement an external filter. But yeah, so we're going to cut up a piece of hose which just barely fits across this length, because eventually when we reinstall it on the car, this top hat is going to be compressed a little bit, so we want to make sure that that hose has a little bit of room to be able to flex. So let me go ahead and cut up the hose, and then we're going to install it on the top hat. So with that fuel line attached to the top hat and back to the fuel filter outlet here and secured very tightly with hose clamps, we need to try and remove this connector here for the fuel hose so that we can attach it to our new top hat. I found for these, if you kind of pinch the sides a little bit, you can easily get them over the little ring that holds them in place. So give me just a second here to take this off. There we go. So I've got that off now, and I'm going to secure it onto our top hat fitting there for the fuel line. And then after that, our fuel pump is finally complete. Alright guys, now it's finally time to take our modified fuel pump and install it in the fuel tank. Now one thing to remember is to take that hose and reattach it to the side of the fuel pump housing. This is the Venturi pump system that is used to sift gas off of the driver's side of the saddle tank. So you just want to remember to reattach that hose. I've also gone ahead and laid in place that blue seal again. You want to be careful not to expose this to gas just because it's going to deteriorate the seal. I've gone ahead and put it in place already just to make sure that it's sitting nice and flat. If it's not sitting within this groove evenly, you're going to have a hard time screwing down the top hat. So I'm just trying to make sure that it's set correctly. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and lower our fuel pump back into the fuel tank now. Alright, so we're going to begin reinstalling the bolts now for the top hat. Now if you're using the factory top hat, you can just use the original bolts, but CJM has provided new bolts for us because the top hat's probably a little bit thicker, so we're going to use these instead since we've got the aftermarket aluminum billet hat. Alright guys, so the aluminum top hat is now tightened down quite nicely. Also reattached the factory fuel line, which plugs into that clip quite nicely. Next thing we're going to do is talk about wiring. Now this is from the original attempt that I made before I got the top hat here and upgraded to that 340. This was from when I was trying to do the 450. I basically used a bunch of crush clips and things and then plugged it into that factory socket that was on the top hat. So I'm going to show you guys how I did the wiring for that first, and then I'm going to show you guys how I'm going to redo the wiring for the top hat as well as to make room for the Radeon system, which I'm going to be installing soon. The next thing we need to do is we need to wire in the harness. Now unfortunately we can't just plug this back in because we're going to need to run a new power wire. You see, the new fuel pump is actually going to require the 12 gauge wire that comes with the relay kit to be able to wire this fuel pump in, and it's very difficult to modify this harness to be able to fit that wire. So instead what I'm going to do is one by one, I'm going to snip each of these wires, attach one of those female spade connectors, and we're going to place it in the socket. To make it easier, we're going to snip off some of this insulation so that we get a little more length of wire to work with. The black and red one here for the fuel pump, we're going to snip those, but we're going to be wiring it into the relay. So I'll talk to you guys about that in a bit. Make sure that before you begin cutting into the harness, you have the battery unplugged. Again, it should still be unplugged, but you want to make sure that as you start messing with the wires, you're not going to end up shorting anything. So I'm going to go ahead and cut the insulation. Alright, so I've cut away a few inches of the insulation, so I've got some flexibility here at the wires. I'm going to start cutting these one by one, the 4 that I named earlier, and I'm going to plug those into the corresponding locations in the socket using the spade terminals. So I've got those first 4 wires done there. Again, put them in the same locations according to the back of this socket. Now what I'm getting ready to do is try and find a location to run all of the wires. So those 2 wires for the fuel pump are going to be sent to the relay kit. And I need to find a good ground source, like a bolt or something in the chassis. All right, so I've got the side panel off. I'm looking for a good location to connect the relay. We want a really good connection with ground. Most of the bolts that you'll find around the car, I say most, should have a good ground connection. I didn't want to do it behind the seatbelt though, but I did find, if y'all can see way down in there, there's a little bolt, I think it's a 10 millimeter. That I've already tested with a multimeter, and it does have a really nice ground connection. All right guys, I'm gonna try and take a second here to explain the wiring. The hardware wiring kit does come with a diagram that shows where each of the relay connections are supposed to go, but they do leave out a couple of things, so I just wanna kind of explain this to you guys. So, as I said earlier, the whole point of this relay is to allow us to use this thicker gauge wire so that we can put more current into the fuel pump. So there are 4 connections on here. First off, we're gonna have that black wire. That needs to connect to ground. So I went ahead and cut it shorter. I put on a little loop connector, and that loop connector is just going to go back around and it's going to attach to that bolt that we found there on the frame. So that's going to be the ground wire for this relay. We've also got the power wire here, which is in red. This is going to be a really long wire. If you can see here, it's going to run all the way to the front of the car. We're going to get back to this wire in a minute. Next we have this yellow wire. This yellow wire is going to be the power to the fuel pump itself. Now I have on the very end of this, you can see there I've got attached a small little female spade connector. That spade connector is going to go into the positive terminal for the socket. So that's going to actually run the fuel pump. Now we still need to send a control signal to this. The wiring harness here, I've gone ahead and cut off the last 2 wires. These were the original power wires for the fuel pump. This positive terminal is still going to act as our signal to actuate the pump, but we're going to be drawing power through the relay. So this positive terminal is going to connect to that blue one, and if I follow that blue wire to the end, I've actually left it kind of bare because I'm going to need to strip this, and we're going to solder it into this positive terminal here. And then we've got a black wire here, which is the ground for the original connection. We're going to go ahead and solder in a negative terminal here. Let me see if I can find that wire. I've got this wire that I made, so we're just going to use this end to solder it together. This loop connector is also going to attach to that grounding location, so this will just kind of ground that control signal that we have coming from the car. And then last but not least, and I know all the electric connections here are maybe kind of confusing, hopefully this explains it a bit better. So we've got an additional grounding wire. This grounding wire is the one that's actually going to be pulling current through the fuel pump. So on here I've got a female spade connector. That's going to connect down into the socket. And then I've just got another loop connector here which is going to connect to ground. So I've got that relay hooked up now, and you can see all 3 of those ground wires attached as well. I've got the positive lead there that goes to the battery running through the same route as all the wiring for my amplifier. That just kind of comes along here and goes through the edge of the car. I'll get back to this in a second. But I've got 4 of those wires coming out, the power wires for the fuel pump, as well as the 2 connections for the old fuel pump signals. So I've got all 4 of these wires coming out. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to route them through the gap here. I'm going to make a small piercing in this grommet, run the wires through that, and yeah, I'll catch up with you guys in a second. All right, so I've got everything wired up, and I know it still looks like a mess here. We're going to clean this up after we've tested the fuel pump. The only wire that we have left to connect is the positive lead here to the battery. Now I've got it running through the exact same path that I've run all my speaker wires and things. I've currently got it pulled out of this plastic tab over here. I've kind of just been looping it through this like gap that's in this plastic tab that holds the carpet. So now I need to send this into the engine bay, and for that I've got some of the old speaker wire here on a spool that I've managed to run through. Let me come around to the other side. There's this rubber seal here in the engine bay, and I put a small incision here to be able to thread through this wire. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie the power wire for that relay. I'm going to tie it together with the speaker wire, and I'm going to pull it through the engine bay, and then we can connect it to the battery. Alright guys, so it's time to show you the new and improved electrical system that I have. So first and foremost, here is that socket that I ended up building out just like for the top hat on the bottom side, we also have to install each of the different wires that are leading into our fuel pump in this socket here on the top side of the fuel pump. So basically what I did was I wired in the 4 wires for the 2 sensors, the fuel temperature as well as the fuel level. Those are all wired in the same numbered positions as I had labeled them earlier in the different pin diagrams that I showed you guys. The couple of additions that we have here, so the ground wire for the fuel pump originally is now soldered into one of these black 12 gauge wires, and that goes into that location in the back over here where I used to have the relay. We've also got a ground wire leading to the actual fuel pump, the upgraded fuel pump. That's also leading to that same grounding location back there. With ground locations, you just got to find anywhere on the chassis that is pretty well sanded down and doesn't have a coating on it, and that way you'll get a good ground connection. So I ended up actually sanding that little plate down there where that's attached to, so that way it's got a good connection. Additionally, we've got this blue wire here. This is the power wire that leads to our relay. Now I'm going to show you guys where I'm putting the relay here in a second, but this is going to lead into the positive terminal of our fuel pump. And then the last wire that I've got here, this yellow wire, is the trigger or the sense wire that's from the positive wire for the original harness. So that small little wire that was originally powering our fuel pump, that attaches to this. Alright, so continuing from where we left off, those blue and yellow wires are going to wrap all the way around in between the side paneling over here. And then this wiring leads to the ECU. Now in order to get this ECU out, I had to take out this entire panel, the whole glove box section. You can kind of see it's still dangling over there. It's connected by a harness. Now here is the relay that I am installing in my system. It's got 3 relays I'm going to be using. The lift pump is the one that I'm currently installing. That's just going to go in the standard gas tank location, or in the standard pump location. So this setup is a little more complex than what probably most of y'all will do. You can do a traditional fuel return system where you're only going to need 1 pump, and then you can just put this relay anywhere you want. But because I'm going to have multiple relays, I decided just to go ahead and get a box, and then I've got 3 spare here which I can use in the future. So yeah, this is how I've got my stuff wired, guys. Again, you can just use 1 single relay if you're going to do like a traditional fuel return system, but I'm going to talk about the benefits of this like surge tank system that I'm putting in my next video, and it's going to act as my version of a return fuel system for my car. But anyways, without further ado, so yeah, we've got pretty much all of the electrical wiring done. And as I said, that power cable goes up. I can show you guys over here. It comes up through that little seal there that leads past the firewall. All you gotta do is like use a knife or something to cut a small hole in it, and then you can run your cable all the way through. And it just runs all the way to the positive terminal of the battery. Now eventually I'm gonna put in like a little circuit breaker like I have for the power cable that leads to my amp. You really don't wanna run a really length of cable attached to your positive terminal without putting in some sort of fuse or whatever, just because you don't want it to short on anything and then cause a lot of current draw from the battery. So yeah, I'm going to go ahead and install that probably when I do the surge tank, but since all the wiring's done, guys, it's pretty much time to test the pump. So I'm now going to go ahead and reconnect my negative terminal, and then I'm going to set my camera up to watch our fuel pressure, and hopefully everything's going to work. We're just going to hit the start button a couple of times to prime the pump up, get the accessories to turn on, and we're going to check our fuel pressure to see if it matches the original fuel pressure that we got from the car before we put this new fuel pump in. I've also got the ECU Molex connectors plugged in as well. I'm just kind of leaving it dangling right now. I've gone through and tried to double check all of my connectors. Everything seems to be okay, so now let's see if we can prime the pump. My first attempt to prime the pump didn't go as planned because I hadn't reinstalled the ECU back to the chassis, which is the ground connection for my relay box. But on the second attempt, I did manage to get the fuel pump to fire up, but I wasn't able to get pressure. When you prime your pump, you should be able to hear it start up. It'll sound something like this. This sound indicates that the fuel pump is functioning properly. Now when you hit the start-stop button a couple of times without putting your foot on the clutch, it's only going to put the key in the on position, but it's not going to attempt to start the car. Now this only primes the pump for a few seconds, and I believe this wasn't enough time to actually get enough fuel in the fuel lines to get it pressurized. But after repeating the step a couple of times by trying to prime the pump, turning the car off, trying to prime it again, I eventually managed to get the pressure up, I imagine because fuel had finally filled up the fuel lines, and it primed all the way up to 50 psi, which is where we would expect to see it. Alright guys, so it's the next day now. I just started the car to make sure that it seems to idle okay, and it is currently idling about 650 RPM. which is about where I would expect it to be. I'm gonna let it idle for a little while so it can recharge the battery, and just to make sure that there's no hiccups with the fuel pump and to make sure it's just continually pumping fuel correctly. I'm also gonna monitor my fuel pressure to make sure there's no weird fuel pressure spikes or anything. I will say, honestly, that my fuel pressure is a little bit high. It's currently sitting at about 60 PSI and it's supposed to be at 52. This is probably an indicator that the orifice on that Venturi system probably wasn't drilled out enough. I'm not terribly concerned about this high pressure though, because it's only going to be a lift pump over to the surge tank when I eventually install that Radion system. I'm not concerned that the pressure be tuned to a precise amount. But for those of you who are just going to be using the pump that we just replaced as your sole pump for the engine, if you are running at a high PSI like this, you might consider going and re-drilling your Venturi system a little bit wider, just to make sure that it's able to regulate the fuel pressure correctly to get you back down to 52 PSI. But I'm going to let this idle for a little bit and try and clean up the mess, because this was quite a long build. I spent too many hours on this. But yeah, let me go ahead and get the garage cleaned up and we'll make sure that the car is still running fine afterwards. Alright guys, I just got finished test driving the car and it runs pretty much perfectly. It feels exactly as stock. There's pretty much no difference, and there really shouldn't be. I have gotten this question from you guys. If you install a new upgraded fuel pump in your car and you haven't done anything else to it yet, you can drive it around without having to tune the car, as long as your fuel pressure is sitting at about the same amount that you should have had with the OEM pump, which whenever you're on idle it should be about 52 PSI. One thing I do want to mention is that when I shut my fuel pump off, my fuel pressure does begin to bleed off a little bit slowly. That may be due to the fact that there might be a hose fitting somewhere within the housing that is maybe just slightly loose, because if it's above 20 PSI or so, I quickly lose pressure. So what I'm probably going to do when I go to install my Radion system is I'm probably going to open that housing back up and double check my fittings and just trying to get everything tightened down. It may be possible that I'm also losing fuel through the fuel pump itself. There is a check valve in there that's supposed to prevent fuel from going backwards, but if that check valve is slightly stuck open or something, it might be causing it to lose pressure when the pump is not running as well. So I may need to go back and also possibly consider using a different pump. But this isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you do get a little bit of fuel pressure bleed off like that, it just means that starting the pump can be a bit tricky sometimes, because you'll have to prime the pump before you actually put the clutch in to try and start the car. So it just makes it a tad inconvenient when you're starting the vehicle. But that's about going to wrap it up, guys. I apologize for the length of this video. There was just a ton of detail that I wanted to show you guys in installing the fuel pump, so you got an idea of what exactly was involved in doing this project, as well as kind of show you guys some of the mistakes that I made. That way you can avoid making the same mistakes when you go to upgrade your fuel pump. I will probably be doing the fuel injector video next. It's going to be much shorter than this one. There's not as much involved in trying to get the injectors upgraded, hopefully. And then afterwards we will be doing the Radion fuel pressure regulation system, and I'll probably be trying to look at seeing if I can figure out where that fuel bleed issue is coming from that I'm currently having right now. But thank you guys for watching this video. If you're new to the series, like and subscribe, because I am installing a supercharger in the car pretty soon and doing complete DIY on everything. So it'll be really cool to kind of follow that and give you an idea of what's involved in installing a supercharger in your car. But thank you guys for watching. Like and subscribe if you're not already a subscriber, and I'll see you all in the next video. Later.